Hello, my name is Robert Edsel. I'm the founder and chairman of the Monuments Men and Women Foundation, the 2007 recipient of the National Humanities Medal awarded by President Bush for our work honoring these men and women who saved so much of our cultural history, and also the author of a number of books, including The Monuments Men, and most recently, the book we're going to talk about today, Remember Us, a remarkable story set against the most destructive war in history that I find is an inspiring, uplifting story about remembrance, gratitude, and grace. The story for me began as a consequence of the Congressional Gold Medal ceremony that we organized for the Monuments Men and Women in 2015. The Speaker of the House, John Boehner, contacted us, and we'd worked 9 years on trying to get passage of this recognition for the Monuments Men and Women who'd been overlooked. They came home from war in 1950-51, and by then we were, of course, engaged in other wars. And he asked us to organize the reception ceremony for the presentation of the medal. And, of course, I said to him, that's not our job, that's what you do. And he said, yes, but you know all the people, you know all the relatives. So we organized this, had several hundred family members of Monuments Men and Women from 14 different countries attend in the halls of Congress. And one of them responded and RSVP'd, said, of course I'll be there. His name was Jim Huchthausen. Now, Jim was the nephew of one of the two Monuments Men killed during combat during World War II, the one American, Walter Huchthausen, Captain Walter Huchthausen. And he wrote and said, yes, I'll be there. And by the way, I just got back from London, south of London, and I had a wonderful visit with Frieda and her husband, and I'm enclosing a photograph. And I looked at this photograph and I thought, Frieda, I don't know any Frieda. And then it occurred to me several days later, the only Frieda I know was this 19-year-old girl who in September 1945, a few months after the end of the war, wrote Harvard and explained that she and her family were very close friends with Captain Huchthausen, and they were devastated to find out he'd been killed a month before the war was over in April 1945. And she was hoping that the university could provide the name and address of his mother because she wanted to write and tell her that she walked 5 miles to the American military cemetery in Margraten in the Netherlands and 5 miles home to place flowers on his grave several times a week. The university responded and provided that information to her, and in fact, I recalled having come across that correspondence in the research on the Monuments Men, and I wrote about it at the very end of the Monuments Men, but it had never occurred to me to check and see whether she might still be alive, and in fact, she was. I felt duty-bound and curious to go meet this woman, the last person to see Captain Huchthausen before he was killed. So the following few months later, after months of exchanging letters with this now at the time 88-year-old lady, we became close pen pals and friends. I arrived in London and drove about 3 hours south, and she bear hugged me at the front door of her house and asked me to come in and said, you want to see the photographs of when the Americans liberated us in September 1944? And I said, absolutely, I love photographs. So she invited me into her breakfast room. She had these photo albums already laid out on the table, and she went through one after the other, and there she was standing on the front porch as these American tanks were passing by. Joyous moment. And she asked me, have you been to the American Military Cemetery? And I said, you mean the Netherlands American Cemetery? Because that's what we call it today. And she said, yes. And I said, yeah, I've been there. She said, so you're sure you've been there? And I said, yes, I'm very sure I've been there. And she said, so you know about the grave adoption program? And I said, the what? And she said, the grave adoption program. And I was embarrassed because I didn't know about it. And I said to her, I have no idea what you're talking about. Tell me about it. She said, well, I don't know all the details, but I know that, all of the boys there, and there were a few women, all the boys there were adopted by people like us that knew a lot of these boys. And I said, well, adopted, what does that mean? She said, well, we would go out and put flowers on their graves, and if we had the name and address of their family member, we'd take a photograph of their grave and send it to them. And I said, well, that's amazing. But, how many people did that? And she said, well, I don't know. I think a lot of people did it. I said, yeah, but there were a lot of boys buried there. Well, I was so overwhelmed about this, much as I was when I asked this question 20 years ago about how did all the works of art survive the most destructive war in history, and who are the men and women that saved it all. Just pure curiosity, that's all it was. And here I was asking what seemed like a very simple question, how do I not know about this grave adoption program? I've never heard of it. So I told her I needed to go off and do some research on this. I wanted to find out more about it. And I spent several months doing what preliminary research I could. My wife asked me, said, do you have ambitions here? And I said, ambitions like what? And she said, writing another book. And I said, no, are you kidding? No, I'm not going to write another book. It just seems extraordinary that I haven't heard about this thing, if it's at all like she says it is. So I want to find out about it, just for my own gratification. Well, several months later, I went back to see Frieda again a second time, and I asked her, tell me everything you told me all over again. Now I have some framework within which to hear your story. And I was astonished. I felt uplifted. It just was extraordinary to me that in a world where promises don't mean much anymore, the Dutch would have promised to take care of these men and women's memories. And it seemed, based on what I knew at the time, that they had continued to do this. So I had a number of times I visited with Frieda and gathered all the information I could from her. And that led me to the second person who helped me tell this story, a woman named Emily Michels van Kestink. I'll just refer to her as Emily. Emily was the wife of the mayor of Maastricht, which is the regional capital in the region of Limburg, very southern part of Netherlands. And she died in 1970, but her oldest daughter, Jenneke, who was 90 when I first met her, told me that Mom can help you tell the story. And I said, well, how is she going to do that? She's not here anymore. No, she kept these memory books, basically photo albums or diaries, it's more accurate, that she tipped in photographs, Wrigley spearmint chewing gum wrappers, flak that had fallen from the sky, anything that was a memory, cut out photographs, old newspaper articles, but she documented every single day of the war and the experience of what life was like in the Netherlands before the war. She was the mom of ultimately 12 children. She'd had 7 before the war started, before the Netherlands were invaded, 3 during the war, 1 right at the end of the war, and then 1 a year later. Remarkable woman, number of miscarriages, as you might imagine. An extraordinary woman who was a woman of action and knew how to get things done. And I asked Jenneke, I said, so do you know about this grave adoption program? And she said, well, I don't know that much about the program. And I said, well, were you one of these adopters? And she said, yes, we all were. And I said, so you were a little girl at the time. And she said, well, I was 11 or 12, but I had my own soldier, and all of my brothers and sisters did, my parents did. Ultimately, we had 14 graves that we were the adopters for. Well, this whetted my appetite even further, so I waded in more. And it started off in the sense of asking really 3 questions. I'm a big believer that the answers are easier to come by than the questions. If you're asking the right questions, then you'll get to the answers. And the first question, of course, was, where is the Netherlands? Where's this area that we're talking about? We Americans aren't world record winners for our understanding of geography. So the Netherlands is sitting right on top of Belgium, west of Germany. And this area of the Netherlands is a little dog leg that sticks down. And if you go it's a narrow, thin strip pointed more or less north and south. And if you go a few miles to the west, you're in Belgium. A few miles to the east, you're in Germany. And a few miles to the south, you're in France. So it's a strange area that has more in common with these other countries in their dialects. And I had been to this area many a time, to Maastricht, to an art fair that they have there every year, and had been to the cemetery, as I told Frieda, several times to see the grave of Captain Hutchhausen when I was researching the Monuments Men. And the area was terribly important because we, in World War II, had these hugely important battles that all happened right around this area. Now, we tend to think of World War II, we think of it in the context of the battles in North Africa and Sicily and Italy. proper in the mainland. Of course, D-Day in France as a result of the Normandy landings. But Netherlands as a country doesn't really get as much focus. But the battles that were fought there we know about. Operation Market Garden, the largest airborne invasion. The Battle of Aachen, which was a house-to-house struggle that was hugely devastating, that happened in late September, October 1944. The Battle of Hürtgen Forest, the most long-standing battle, and then, of course, the Battle of the Bulge, which was immensely costly to American soldiers, some 20,000 Americans killed there. And all four of these battles happened within 50-mile radius of this area that we're talking about in Limburg province, around Maastricht and Margraten. And the area was liberated by Ninth Army in September 1944. Market Garden, of course, failed. We were successful in liberating Eindhoven and Nijmegen. The bridge that was too far in Arnhem was an area that we did not hold. Immense losses there, capturing of Allied troops. And then this area of Limburg was liberated, not because we were trying to liberate the Netherlands, but because we were trying to get to Aachen and create this pincer move of bringing troops around to the northern part of Germany beyond the Siegfried Wall through Market Garden and then through the south and through Aachen. Well, when both battles either failed in the case of Market Garden or turned into a prolonged struggle as Aachen, General Eisenhower made the decision to wait out the weather that he knew was coming and so resupply the lines, get fresh troops in there, ammunition, food, fuel, etc., with our lines so extended, and prepare for a spring offensive. So Ninth Army, which was headed by General Simpson, which was our largest army of all the armies by the end of the war, had tens of thousands of troops that were in this area doing what combat troops typically don't do, which was not moving, stationary. And they had a chance to get to know a lot of the people in the Netherlands. And this area looked familiar to a lot of the boys that were coming off farms. It's beautiful farmland. Everything grows, orchards everywhere, people working the fields with their hands. And that was familiar to the boys. The people there recognized a lot of kids that were coming from farms, and they were so immensely grateful to the Americans that they welcomed them into their homes. They all had them live in the barns. They did everything they could do to try and make life a bit easier for them. And that was really, really important to understand about the story. We then approached what was the second question for me, and that was, what became of our dead soldiers in Europe during the war? Now, we see these movies and battlefields with dead boys lying on them, and then it seems like all the movies largely cut to the next scene. But what does happen to a soldier when it's killed? That was a question that I had, and because it was something I'd never thought about. And it's, in a way, it's a car wreck that you don't want to look at, that you can't not look at, because it is a fascinating subject. And while it might sound a gruesome thing to focus on momentarily, it's an absolute undivorceable element of war. This isn't a what happens if soldiers are killed. This is what do you do when your soldiers are killed, because it's going to happen. You know that when you're fighting a war, you need fuel, you need ammunition, you need soldiers, of course, but you also need a place to bury your dead. And each army largely was responsible for finding areas to bury the dead. And for the most part, those temporary cemeteries were created where there were significant casualties, because there was the emergency of getting these boys into the ground. General Eisenhower had promised his troops, nobody's going to be buried on enemy soil. General Simpson repeated that a number of times. So the temporary cemetery, the American Military Cemetery Margraten that was set up, was established just 10 miles west of the German border, west of the town of Aachen, which is right on the German-Dutch border. And it was there that the cemetery construction began in October, November 1944. The first boys were brought there in November 1944. The soil was very difficult to work with, extensive mud and clay. The shovel went in weighing 3 or 4 pounds. It came out weighing 9 or 10 pounds because of all the clay that was stuck to it. It was fortunate for a lot of these guys if they could dig one grave in a day. Rain, cold, freezing weather, and would ultimately get to this horrific winter most of us know about that took place in 44, 45. There was a stripping line that was established on the perimeter of the cemetery. The stripping line had a series of tents. There were different responsibilities for each tent. This was really dangerous work because a lot of the soldiers had live ammunition on them. They may be coming in and have their hand frozen, and in it is a grenade with a pin pulled. A lot of them had live ammunition inside their clothes. There were autopsies performed. All personal objects were removed. The dog tags removed. If they placed one of the dog tags in the mouth of the soldier, if there was a head. The other dog tag was hammered onto the wooden cross. They didn't have time to stencil names onto them. The boys were brought out in their clothes and with their boots and laid onto bed sacks that were used in lieu of coffins because there was no wood. The graves were dug by Black Americans that we were more comfortable handing a shovel to than a gun. American quartermaster troops. They were responsible and had the most difficult task during the war of these burials, lifting each soldier up or body parts. It took 2 or 3 soldiers to do so. They had to lift them up, lower them into one of these mattress sacks, and then they carried them to the grave and lowered them and buried them there. And they were tightly packed together, one grave next to the other, and this is how it went. And at the end of the war, in May 1945, there were 17,800 American boys and some women buried at the American Military Cemetery in Margraten. It was our largest World War II cemetery in Europe at the end of the war. My book, Remember Us, tells the story of what took place there through the lives of 10 or 11 different men and a couple of women that I chose out of the thousands of military records of boys out there that we went through. There were so many great stories, so many more than I could tell. You know, we always talk about how great it would be to find some untold story about heroes in World War II. Well, our cemeteries are filled with them, but you can't tell a story about 17,800 men and women, and you can't do it for even 10% or 1% of that. So I picked the 10 whose lives all converge in this area. Some of the characters die, some do not. I wanted to make sure that I reminded readers that we're a country of immigrants. We were, we are, we always will be. And that was a strength of the country, coming together, setting aside our differences, uniting to fight a common cause. And the same took place during World War II. I picked a fellow named Lieutenant Colonel Robert Cole, he's straight out of Hollywood casting. This guy was one of the early participants in 101st Airborne. He actually trained with Lieutenant Colonel Eisenhower at Fort Lewis many, many years earlier. He knew Ike. And as fate would have it, they ended up seeing each other on the tarmac outside London in England, June 5th in the afternoon, shortly before boarding the aircraft to begin the landings in Normandy, of course, the evening before being dropped into France. And Eisenhower and Cole recognized each other, and they had a chat there on the airstrip that was recorded both in film and photographs, and we included that along with a number of other photographs in the book. So a remarkable moment that they're reconnecting there. But Cole was a hard charger and would receive the Medal of Honor for his heroic service during the Normandy landings in Carrington, and was just a tremendous soldier and a professional soldier. His father was also an officer. He was born on Fort Sam Houston, so his army was in his blood. Remarkable guy. He landed. He dropped into Market Garden. That would be the next assignment that he would have, and he recognized how dangerous that was. A fantastic character for us to tell people. I included the story of two twins, 21-year-old boys, Edward and James Norton, who were allowed, in the Army's infinite wisdom, the Army Air Force, to pilot and co-pilot the same airplane. And they were bomber pilots in a very fateful raid that took place in 1943, trying to cross the North Sea and work their way to Germany for a bombing mission in Netherlands, actually, to knock out a German U-boat station. And it was a mission that was fateful. It never should have been ordered, this second mission. Wonderful characters to introduce. I also wanted to make sure people understood what was it like for these quartermaster troops digging these graves. And that brought me to a black American named Jeff Wiggins, who was from Dothan, Alabama, who lived an absolutely horrific childhood growing up there with the discrimination, the KKK. His earliest memory as a 6-year-old was the crackling sound of a fire outside the shack that he lived in with his brothers and sisters, and he opened the panels to see a dozen or so hooded Ku Klux Klansmen with a burning cross there, looking for his daddy to hang him because he'd committed the unpardonable crime of selling a bale of cotton when the cotton farmer didn't want to sell because of low prices, because he needed to feed his family. So Jeff joined the Army. He lied about his age. He was not quite 17. He wanted to show that he was as worthy as any other white American, and became a quartermaster troop, which for the most part responsible with delivery of fuel, trucks, ammunition. They do all sorts of things, including digging graves, but of course that wasn't what he anticipated doing, and he found out that's what he was going to be doing on a morning in October when his CEO told him to get the boys ready. They were going to be moving out at 4 in the morning, and he asked where we were going, what are we going to be doing? And the CEO said, you'll find out when we get there. The smells when the trucks stopped kind of gave away what was coming up, and they opened the tarp on the back of the truck and got out, and they could hear the pickaxes and shovels hitting what sounded like hard surfaces, and were horrified to see bodies that were stacked up, as they referred to it at the time, like cordwood, preparing to be buried. And I've spent so much time understanding that aspect of war, what these men went through doing this, and I think the part that I found the most horrific was the monotony of it. When's this going to be over, sir? I don't know. When's the fighting going to be over? When's the killing going to end? And this was the challenge that they faced in this horrible job. The third question that was so fascinating to me, of course, the one that really began in meeting Frieda, was how did the Dutch create a grave adoption program? Who were the people that thought of it? How did they ever execute this? And it started in November 1944 in the most innocent of ways. There was one civilian, Dutch civilian, who was allowed to be out there at the cemetery because it's an American military operation, and he's wandering around the cemetery in a suit. And an officer, a captain from South Carolina, saw him and went over and asked him who he was and what he was doing. And he said, well, I'm allowed to be here because I speak English fluently. And the mayor of Margraten, this little town of 1,200 people, which is 9/10 of a mile from the cemetery, thought it might be helpful to the Army if I was out here to answer any questions. And this guy said, well, in fact, my cousin is buried here, and I've just gotten orders and I've got to ship out. I would be so beholden to you if you'd watch over his grave. And Joseph van Lars, this Dutch fellow, said, well, of course I'll watch over it. In fact, I'll in essence adopt it. Now, he meant it in a figurative sense. And some other soldiers saw these two guys talking and came walking over to him and asked him what he was talking about. And he explained what had happened. And they said, well, that's ironic because we're getting ready to be shipped out and we have a bunch of buddies that are buried here and we just came to see where their graves were. Would you mind watching over them too? And Van Lars said, no problem at all. It'd be a great honor. 2 months later, at the end of January 45, now we still have 4 more months of fighting, the mayor of Margraten, a man named Ronkers, organized a meeting of their town council, 6 or 7 guys, and Joseph van Lars attended this meeting. And the purpose of the meeting was to discuss trying to find an answer to this question: how do you thank your liberators when they're no longer alive to think? They're asking this question, and the fighting is still going on. They had some ideas, parades, special masses. And then Van Laar spoke up and said, I have an idea. He said, I've had so many soldiers and officers come up to me and ask me to watch over the graves of their buddies, and I've told everybody yes, and I can't possibly do it all. Maybe we could create some sort of program for local citizens to watch over these graves. Well, Ronkers knew a good idea when he heard it. And that was the beginning of what we know today as the grave adoption program. There was a young parish priest who'd just been assigned to that area, and Ronkers gave him the task of trying to find local people to volunteer to watch over the grave and go out and put flowers on it. And that's how it began. One or two people did it. Frieda did it. Emily's family did it. And other people that knew some of these boys, and as I said, a couple of girls, they did it. And the thing, by May 1945, when the war's over, 4 months later, and the very first Memorial Day takes place, they have a couple of hundred graves adopted, just a few hundred. However, there were 40,000 Dutch people that attended the first Memorial Day ceremony at Margraten. 40,000 people. Now, the towns around there are all a few thousand here, a few thousand there. They didn't have any vehicles. There wasn't any gasoline. They walked. They came on their bikes. Some rode horses. Some came in buggies, all dressed up in their Sunday come-to-meeting clothes to pay respects and say goodbye to these American soldiers, many of whom they knew. The New York Times said, seeing foreigners venerate Americans in that way was unprecedented. Emily had been helping the American Army and leadership there provide distractions and entertainment for the frontline troops. And she then, with that being done, threw herself into trying to help with the grave adoption program. The American Army refused to provide names and addresses of the next of kin. They got some of this information off dog tags. Of course, they knew some of the boys from them staying with them. But Emily grew increasingly frustrated and tried every way she could to get that information. She even at one point in time in the summer, late summer 1945, wrote the Chief Executive Officer of the United States of America, President Truman. And she said, now that all of the American boys are going home, except for those who are buried in our soil, we would like to solidify the relationship that people in the Netherlands have with America. And she pleaded for him to intercede and provide these names and addresses. Well, it was a beautiful letter, but it accomplished nothing. The letter was forwarded over to the War Department, and ultimately she got a polite rejection letter from the Quartermaster General in the United States. What was animating and inspiring Emily was this. Letters were starting to arrive at mayor's offices throughout Limburg from families and others in the United States who'd lost a boy during the war. And the letters went something like this. A letter arrived from a lady named Maybelle File in Demopolis, Alabama, and she said, I'm 26 years old. My husband was killed on his 25th birthday a few weeks ago. He was my everything. I would be beholding to you all the days of my life if you could take a photograph of his grave and send it to me. Well, Emily's husband, the mayor of Maastricht, received this letter, and he handed it to her and said, this looks like something you could do. She went out there and took a photograph of the grave with her two daughters and mailed it to her. Well, this 26-year-old woman, amazing, she read the letter, saw the photograph, and then composed a letter to the editor of Life magazine, included the photograph, and sent it to Life and said, I know there's a lot of other grieving widows. There's a lot of people that are suffering, families and stuff that are missing their boys. And there's this really nice lady in Maastricht named Emily, and I just know she'd be willing to help other people like she helped me. Well, Life magazine published her letter. They published the photograph. and thousands of letters from America started arriving in Maastricht. Some of these American families that wrote, their boys were killed somewhere in some other country other than the Netherlands, but it was someone to talk to, someone to communicate with, and that inspired them to write. By the time 1946 rolls around, the second Memorial Day, 40,000 Dutch people attend a second time. And Emily, in a height of frustration, decides the only way they're going to make progress getting these names and addresses for the adopters, who now number 17,800. So I'm not speaking in error here. Within 1 year, from 1945 May to 1946 May, the grave adoption program exploded, and volunteers appeared everywhere, each wanting to adopt some boy or girl that was buried out there, so that every single American buried there by May 1946 had a Dutch adopter. And the challenge was, and Emily understood this acutely because of these letters that had come from America, as noble as it was to adopt the graves of dead Americans, the greater need was to reach across the ocean into the homes of American families and try and assuage their grief. And to do that, they had to have the names and addresses of the next of kin. So Emily traveled to the United States in June 1946. It was the first airplane she'd ever flown on. She landed at LaGuardia Field. She spent a few days in New York meeting members of Congress, including a young fellow from Texas named Lyndon Johnson, who said, "Young lady, if you want to meet families that are connected to military, go to Texas. There's a lot of military bases there." She flew to Dallas, Texas, where I'm from. She visited with the family 3 blocks from where I live. She went to Lockhart, traveled throughout Texas, across the southeast to Atlanta, all the way up the East Coast. And for 5 weeks, she was in a different home of an American family that had lost somebody every single night, all impromptu. People drove her from place to place. She spent the night with someone. She went to American Legion and VFW halls. And to everyone, she said, it will be several years before you get notification from the United States asking you to choose whether you want to have your boys sent home or left overseas. Leave your boys with us. We'll watch over them like our own forever. A forever promise. 81 years later, there are 10,000 boys and 4 women who are buried or memorialized in the walls of the missing at the Netherlands American Cemetery. 10,000. 8,000 were brought home by their families. That was the lowest percentage brought home from any of what became the permanent cemeteries. The Dutch today, the 10,000 adopters, are only in contact with 2,000 of the American families. There's 8,000 families they've never been able to find. When I write books, I really don't think of myself as an author. I think of myself as a messenger. There was a message to the Monuments Men story. We need to work hard to preserve our shared cultural heritage. We should have monuments officers again. We now do. We should preserve these men and women's history and put it to use. They should be thanked by our country through the Congressional Gold Medal. The Monuments Men and Women Foundation has gotten all those things done. Our work continues. But to what end valuing the preservation of our shared cultural heritage if we don't have our freedom? And the Dutch understood that in a way that so many Americans don't. They have their children out there on Veterans Day and Memorial Day. They're in the 3rd generation of adopters. They have 1,000 people on the waiting list to become adopters, even though the turnover is only about 30 a year. It is inspiring to see the commitment they have. And that cemetery there is in a way like Field of Dreams. You go and it's an inspiring place to be because of the youthfulness that's there and the life that they've brought to all these men and women who are buried there. The Monuments Men and Women Foundation understood the higher calling on this story, the messenger, if you will, and we created a joint venture with the Dutch Foundation for Adopting Graves that we call the Forever Promise Project. They're responsible for managing the adopters. We have taken on the responsibility for raising visibility about the men and women that are buried there. So we created a website, foreverpromise.org. We have a searchable database of all 10,000 men and 4 women that are buried there. And we ask people to go there and check the list. If they have a relative that's buried there, a short questionnaire pops up. What's your relationship? Are you aware there's a grave adoption program? Are you connected with your adopter? Would you like to be connected with your adopter? Will you give us permission to share your contact information with our colleagues in the Netherlands? In just a few months, we've already connected 350 or so American families to the adopters of the graves of their loved ones. And we have new responses every single day. It's a visibility game. That's it. We need to raise national awareness about this whole grave adoption program, the Forever Promise Project, and have more Americans that have boys that are buried over there, or any of these four ladies, go to the website and find us. We're also working on finding people. So that's the story of Remember Us. How did this happen? How did this unique, unparalleled commitment that began even during the war to honor and remember each one of the American veterans that are there, how did it come into being? Remember Us tells that story. And it is an uplifting story set against the backdrop of World War II, not really about World War II. And it's a beautiful story. And I look forward to answering your questions and telling you more about this remarkable journey that we've been on for the last 8 years.
Hi, Robert. How are you? I'm going to ask you to unmute.
Good morning, Alex. I'm well.
Hey.
How are you?
Yeah, I'm great. I love the book. A really moving presentation. Thank you so much. We have a whole bunch of questions. I was a little bit egotistical because I wanted to make sure that you knew that some of us have been to Margraten. And if you look in the chat, you'll see a photograph of me with some young Dutch students at the grave of Robert Cole.
Yeah.
So
one of 6 Medal of Honor recipients that are buried there.
Yeah, no, and we actually, friends, I'm going to give us a little bit of a stroke now, but friends, we went on a trip called the Last Battles Tour, which was basically Market Garden, Herkenforest, Battle of the Bulge. We crossed the Rhine, and that's one of our stops was Margraten, and we're going to be doing it next September. So anybody watching, this is not about Robert, it's not about me, it's about friends' trips coming up next year. Anyway, that's one of our stops. I want to quote you from your book. In April 1946, General Eisenhower provided perspective on the unimaginable, a war that had claimed the lives of 70 million people, including 405,000 Americans. He said, quote, "For a democracy at least, that always stands beyond the materialism and destructiveness of war, those ideals for which it is fought." Can you talk a little bit more about that and your own life mission? Because you've dedicated a considerable part of your life to remembrance, but also with a kind of activism to it. You know, you don't want to just write a book, you want to actually change things. What explains that?
Some sort of mental instability, I'm sure.
Join the club.
You know, I oftentimes refer to the Monuments Men and Women Foundation as a think tank that gets things done. And we have many successes. Sometimes we can't talk about them because the most effective way to help solve a problem or achieve an outcome is for us to work behind the scenes because of the political nature, whether it's been a matter of returning a missing work of art or the current controversy that's going on in Margraten today concerning the black gravediggers. I like to think that all the work that I've done the last 20 years of my life, 25 years now, is the rent I'm paying for the privileges that I've had to be born in this amazing country and have the freedom which too often Americans take for granted. The Dutch don't take it for granted because they lost it for 4 years, 4 months, and 4 days, and they know damn well who got it back for them. And they have been grateful every day since then and have set in place a system to make sure that their children, their grandchildren never forget that. General Eisenhower, in my mind, is such a towering figure as a leader. Yes, we think of him in the context of World War II now. Of course, he served as a president for 2 years. He's, as my 9-year-old son points out, my president, because I was born in 1956 as he was beginning his second term. But Eisenhower, I think, in that quote, which I use very frequently, it's one of my favorites of things that he said, is always kind of pressing reset on understanding what the big picture is. And I look at that cemetery, as I do all of our overseas cemeteries, and think about the fact that these men and women, the guardians that we left behind, continue to watch over. And you didn't mention or haven't mentioned yet, but I will, this phenomenal poem by Archibald MacLeish, who was a poet laureate of the United States and Librarian of Congress at one point in time, titled "Remember Us." Titled "The Young Dead Soldiers Do Not Speak." But the key line, the stanza of this thing is "Remember us, remember us." And he understood that with soldiers, that it was up to us to decide what was their sacrifice for. What value do we give it? It's not their call, it's the living. And are we going to honor that by doing better? Are we going to honor that by trying to bring peace into the picture? Or are we going to render their lives meaningless by not having learned those lessons? And I think that was the message that General Eisenhower was trying to convey to all of us, that we focus on war, we focus on destructiveness, materialism, things people gained from it, whether they were objects or power. But at the heart of it, when General Eisenhower returned to Normandy in 1964, and the interviewer was trying to prompt him to talk about the military aspects, what he wanted to talk about was the thing that mattered most to him, and those were the boys, so many of whom didn't come back.
Do you think that in general there's been a problem since World War II, if not before, that Americans don't have any memory of what war really means as civilians? I mean, they were 19 million European civilians lay dead at the end of World War II. Most of Germany was in ruins. Do you think there's a problem that Americans don't understand war?
Well, we don't know it. Uh, no disrespect to the 7,900 Americans that have been killed in the last 50 years in our wars in Syria and or more so Iraq, Afghanistan, and other places, the destruction of the Marine barracks, etc. Horrible that those men and women lost their lives. But in 2001, I was in St. Petersburg, and we interviewed Mikhail Petrovsky, who is the director of the Hermitage Museum, on a project related to the documentary film I co-produced, Rape of Europa. And this question was asked of him about war, and he looked into the camera and said, "You Americans," this is after 9/11, he said, "You Americans don't know anything about war." And I was standing behind the camera, and I had my hand over my head thinking, oh my God, this interview is going to go so sideways. And he continued and he said, "You know what you know about it? You know about a 4 block by 4 block area in New York City. You haven't had people come into your country in any modern time and steal everything, rape everybody, man or woman, doesn't matter, burn things on their way out, and leave you starting over. You don't know what that's like." Well, he had a very good point. We talk about, when we speak about the looting during World War II, I'm very frequently asked in audiences about the amount of things that the Soviet Red Army took. And there was immense looting by the Soviets, organized and disorganized. But I always point out, because I feel like, as Alex, I'm sure you feel the same, our job as historians is twofold. One, we have to get the facts right. And second, we have to provide context, because the context is everything. And I point out to people there were 25 million citizens, 25 million people in the Soviet Union that were killed during World War II. 17.5 million civilians who didn't start that war and were in the wrong place at the wrong time, and 7.5 million Soviet Red Army soldiers. We lost 400,000 Americans in World War II. 400,000 out of 125 million people. The Soviets lost 25 million out of about the same population. I'm in no way saying that it was legal for the Soviets to take these things or that they should have done it, but it's an important perspective to understand. And I think that was the point of what Petrovsky was saying. And I think it's a valid point. We haven't suffered those losses. We treat our freedom in this country like we turn on the hot water and we expect there to be hot water because there's always been hot water. Except if you're 50 years or younger, that's all you've known. Those of us that grew up in a house with a World War II veteran, much less a parent or grandparent that lived through the Depression, we know something about hardship, not because we learned it in school, we learned it at home, and schools reinforced it. Today, we don't have any more, we're not going to have any more World War II veterans in the next few years. My boys are going to grow up in a world without them. We don't have any people that lived through the Depression, and we don't teach it in schools. So is it surprising that people all the way up to, say, 40 or 50 have no idea where their freedom came from? One final comment on that. We treat freedom like our health. We don't think about it till we're sick. When we're sick, we think, oh my God, this is horrible. You go see a doctor, you take some medicine. 3 or 4 days later, you feel fine. Do you think about your health? No, you don't, not till you get sick again. And that's how we treat our freedom. If we didn't have it, we'd think about it, but we do have it.
Well, I also shared a photograph of the front of your book, and that's not just to sell more books for you, by the way. It's also to highlight the photograph here where the GI, the guy sitting on the front of the Jeep with the young Dutch girl. I mean, it's a beautiful photograph. It's
Mm.
extraordinarily beautiful and evocative. That person hasn't been named yet. That GI hasn't been identified. Am I right in saying that?
When I wrote the book, yes, and we kind of put out an appeal at the in the jacket cover for people to come forward and identify him. His name's Brazelton. He was in the hundred. He was in the 82nd Airborne and was an intelligence officer previous to that, and then went into was in the public affairs. So what we know happened on September 18th, he was part of Market Garden, and he was accompanying some female war correspondents, and they were near the town. They were in Malden near Nijmegen, and if you go on Google Earth, you can actually find this house. It looks exactly the same in the background. The address is a different address, but it's there. These two children, we had great hopes of finding them alive. They would have been 85, 86 or so. Unfortunately, and they're not brother and sister. They were playing in the houses in front of along the street here. They were neighbors, but the girl died about 4 years ago and the boy died about 5 years ago. So we know their families, but we were hoping maybe that we could find them and get something about their story. I want to say with respect to the selling of books, and I thank you so much for any visibility. I've lost more money writing books and doing research than any of the businesses that I ever ran. I've spent 8 years of my life on this book, 15 years on the Monuments Men. I'm an unpaid volunteer to the foundation because I believe in what we were doing. And we needed a story to have a feature film made. You've got to, about a historical subject, you have got to have a book so that Hollywood can allow people, experts like Alex, real historian experts, to vet these things and publicly say either it's right, it's wrong, it's solid, or it's not. And the purpose of the books is to try and get more visibility so that we can change the unawareness or ignorance so that everybody can know this story. That's what we accomplished on Monuments Men. That's the objective here, and it's why we created the Forever Promise Project, is to connect all the rest of these Americans. Out of the 350 we've connected, every one of them said, I had no idea there was a grave adoption program. We haven't had anybody write us and say, oh yeah, I knew about it. So that's the end game here. The book is a way of knowing the story, but it's also a way to say to Americans, really the big question, which our foundation's working on now, why is it we don't have a grave adoption program in the United States,
Yeah.
of American soldiers by Americans.
Yeah.
And that's what we're trying to do. And the Dutch have handed us the template. So the book's important in the context that if you want to understand what's possible and do something more than wave a flag or see a soldier and say thank you for your service, we have an idea, and it's an actionable, doable idea. It's a big idea, but in the 250th year, as we approach this and all the hoopla about, the quintessential, the 250th anniversary, my view is there anything more basic to celebrate than thanking the men and women who provided the freedom that we're getting ready to celebrate? I don't think so.
No, and that brings me to a statement by Janice Blake, and she says this story reminds us that hundreds of thousands of American families lost husbands, brothers, sons. Yet it sounds as though the families that lived on or near the battlefronts have passed the memory of these men down through the generations more actively than we have here at home. Why do you think that is? It's a good question. I mean, everybody looks somewhat lacking when we compare ourselves to the Dutch, not only in terms of looks, their football teams, their culture, their ingenuity, their resilience, but why is it that we haven't done that? You mentioned that earlier on. This is a superficially very patriotic country, but when it comes to this, why haven't we done that? What do you think is going on there culturally?
Well, short attention spans, being busy, the safety of our country, I think, has been a cradle for um, complacency. And it's always been this way for all the Americans, other than the very, very elderly here or anybody that has fought in war. Tom Brokaw, several years ago, referred to with great concern the fraying of the connective tissue between America and the men and women who serve in uniform. And in my view, the volunteer army has made that worse because we have more and more men and women who serve who are coming from military families, so fewer engagement with people. I had a correspondent, a journalist say, so you think we're drifting away from the things that made us great as a country? And I said, no, I don't think we're drifting away. I think we're in full sprint. So, that's a real challenge, I think, for us as a country is to remind people that today we have only 1.5 million men and women in uniform defending and protecting 335 million Americans. During World War II, we had, 16 million men and women in uniform out of 125 million people. But as you know, everybody was engaged somehow. Nobody escaped participation in the war, whether it was through rationing, women going to factories to work while the guys were overseas in combat and so on. So that's the whole effort here, is to remind people it's a lot easier to preserve and protect the freedom that we've got. And I think this cultural ignorance is part of the reason we've had so much acrimony in the country in the last 10 years, is we take this for granted and we don't appreciate how precious it is and how many people in the world would love to have it. And if you think I'm mischaracterizing or exaggerating, go ask the people in Ukraine how difficult it is to get that freedom back when you don't have it anymore. And the Dutch have been there and they got it back because we went over there and helped get it back for them. That was an assumption everybody made would continue indefinitely. And we're in a new time now where that is not a safe assumption anymore.
So, what's your message for all of us? What's the takeaway? How can we help further your cause? What are the things that we can do to realize your mission? How can we help?
Well, thank you for asking that. The most important thing is that people in the country know about the Forever Promise Project, because I want to make sure that we enable the Dutch to fulfill the original mission they had, which was connect all 10,000 adopters to the American families of the men and women that they watch over. And it's really, as I said in my interview, just a visibility game. It's not a complicated process. It's complicated to find people, but it's an easy thing to understand to do. And they're all over the country. It's far easier for them to find us than it is for us to have to go find everybody out there. So raising awareness about that is the best thing that could happen. If you live in a small community, go to our website, find the people in your community, and help us find them. If you know somebody that's a journalist, introduce the story to them and have them write about it, because they'll list the people in that community. If you are wealthy, yes, the foundation can always use financial support. We put it to work. As I said, I'm an unpaid volunteer because we run the philanthropy like a business. We're very, very efficient with our resources. Yes, selling the book, making the book available to people, hugely important to understand if we're really going to learn from this and not just match up soldiers. How did they do it? Why did they do it? What's instructional for us as Americans? When Americans, I've had several people say to me, your idea about a domestic grave adoption program, you're crazy. I mean, how in the world are you ever going to do that? Well, that doesn't really bother me a lot, because I can't tell you how many times I heard I was crazy about the Monuments Men story, and we managed to get that done. I think this is less difficult than that. It's not easy, but it's just the fate of the Republic.
Yeah.
So I think it's worth it.
That's all.
Yeah.
Yeah, the stakes aren't very high, are they? Well, Robert, we're running out of time. I wanted to say thank you so much for joining us. I love what you do. I'm a huge, huge admirer of the mission. I really enjoyed this wonderful book. I'm going to push it on our audience. We have a somewhat evangelist audience. I'm sure they're going to spread the message. I'm going to too. I think what you're doing is very, very important. I'm very, very grateful that you joined us today and gave us your time and your passion. And keep on going, mate. You're doing a wonderful, wonderful job. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Alex. And thank to all you all. I appreciate you giving me your time.
Our pleasure. Thank you very much.